I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the setting in the jail itself, as it's important to understand the setting because the setting itself has a lot to do with how one does ministry in the setting, I'm finding. A lot of this might seem kind of obvious, but it's worth going over. So clearly in a jail, things are highly structured, highly regulated. Almost every movement of an inmate is regulated outside of their cell, and to some degree even in their cell. There's certain things they're not allowed to do even in their cell. And I think that certainly has an effect on people, both the inmates and the staff and correction officers who work there. So right away when you go into the facility, it's very obvious that security is taken very seriously. So when you first walk in, you go through what is essentially like an airport security check-in where they check your person, they scan any like briefcase or what have you might have. You got to take off any kind of metal, and so you kind of go through that checkpoint. From there, there's there's several physical security features, of course, and it's not my intention to detail these other than to give you a sense of kind of the context. So there are a series of doors, or one door they call a sally port, which if you imagine an airlock, it works very much the same way, where it's a chamber, it's a room, probably a little bit bigger than your typical elevator, and it has two doors. And the idea is only one of those doors can ever be open at once. So they open one door, you go into the sally port, they close that door behind you. Then after a few seconds, they open the other door and you can move into the institution proper. And similarly, when you leave, you go through the same gate. And I mention this just because it sets a certain tone. Now, I have to go through that. Every corrections officer has to go through that. Even the highest ranking administrators there, I think they call them superintendents or deputy superintendents. There's different ranks. I won't pretend to understand them all. So even like the most senior people there are still subjected to going through the security procedures as well. They should be. So that gives you a sense. Also, so there's a physical space itself. So if you've seen different television shows and movies about jail or prisons, there's some variance, of course, in how they're depicted, but it's not, in my experience anyway, it's not way off base when you look at the physical space. So it's concrete block, it's like hardened doorways and sort of gates where your movement is sometimes restricted. Even going from like one section to the other, you often have to wait for a door to open before you can proceed into the next section. I think that is just to prevent, like even on the inside, to prevent people from going from one unit to the other without having their access controlled. The other thing that really stands out is the clothing that people wear in the institution. So I think there was a series that I didn't watch from a number of years ago called Orange is the New Black. The idea being that you wear orange as a prisoner or inmate in one of these institutions, and the one I work at is certainly no exception. So all the inmates have to wear this bright orange clothing. There's some variation, shorts, long sleeves, short sleeves, etc., but it's all orange. And through my orientation, they warn us, when you come to work, you can wear more or less whatever you want, but maybe don't wear a bright orange shirt. So if you're a Holland football supporter, maybe don't wear the bright orange football jersey into work. So I typically will wear something like this, sort of normal clothes that I would wear. And then the COs, the correction officers, they themselves also wear a uniform. Again, there's some variants. There's long sleeves, there's pullovers, there's short sleeves, etc. But it is definitely a uniform. It's blue. And so it really and then there's the rest of us. So there's people like chaplains. Nurses will often wear scrubs. So I guess the medical staff, they sort of are depicted that way. And then there's other like social workers, psychiatrists who would wear sort of plain clothes, and other sort of staff members that you might see that are not correction officers, nor the inmates. They're, I guess, other support staff, etc. And you'll also see there's, this is something that didn't really occur to me, but you have all these people living under one roof, or actually technically several roofs, but you get the idea. That there's certain practical things that need to, like light bulbs need to be changed, plumbing needs to be done, electrical work needs to be done. So sometimes there's contractors that come in, and I won't pretend to understand exactly how it works, but clearly that's highly controlled, where they cordon off an area where they might have to do certain work to the institution itself. So those things still need to be attended to, but obviously done in a secure way. And the uniforms, I think, are important because it very clearly lets everyone know sort of what group you're part of. And I mean, the inmates, they're clearly one class, but even the difference between a corrections officer, a CO, and a non-CO, that there's a fairly hard distinction between those two classes of people, even though they both share relative freedom compared to the inmates themselves. The other thing I noticed was how you address people in this institution. I'm not sure how many correction officers work there, and I'm not even sure how the shifts work, but I'm getting to know some of them, like just sort of by face. I recognize them anyway. And then there seems to be lots of COs that you maybe haven't seen before, or you don't recognize. And I get the impression that that's also true for them, where people move from different units. You might know many people, but you certainly don't know everyone. It's not really practical, I don't think, to know everyone who works as a CO in that type of institution. So the tendency is, well, actually it's not a tendency, it's a fairly strict rule, and by that I mean a cultural rule, a cultural norm, is that you address one another with sir or miss. Which took me a little bit of getting used to. You can call, like I'll say officer sometimes, but whether they're officers or staff, the sort of default is sir or miss. So that means like officers will call me sir. And it's interesting because it's, on the one hand, it sort of imposes a certain old-fashioned decorum, which is frankly kind of refreshing, where you say sir and miss even where you wouldn't use a name. So in a, not like, maybe if you're in a public, I don't know, if you're in an office building and you need to squeeze by two people that are talking to get to an elevator and you don't know them, you might just say, excuse me folks, or excuse me, or can I squeeze by here? In the jail context, you would almost certainly say, excuse me sir, or excuse me miss, can I get by? And again, that's for officers talking to non-officers, officers talking to one another, although I suspect they have more colloquial terms that they perhaps use when other people aren't around, perhaps first names. So that, again, sort of sets the different classes of people apart and makes these fairly hard distinctions. And I was just saying with the miss and sir, again, there is something I kind of like about it, to be frank, is it sort of brings back sort of this old-fashioned sort of decorum and formality. At the same time, similar to the uniform, it does function as a way to not be personal, where it sort of says, well, I don't necessarily want or need to know your name, you're just sir or miss. So it can kind of impersonalize things as well. The other thing I noticed is when talking to the inmates, so I'll get more into sort of my work with the inmates, but for now I'll just talk about sort of the naming conventions or how we address one another. So just on the sheets that we have on the inmate lists, often what's next to their cell is usually a first initial and their last name. So also, just for the purpose of these videos, I'm going to make up names. I'm going to use probably common names like Jones and Smith and Williams. There's always the chance that they might actually equal someone who has been at in certain jails at certain times. Any of that is simply coincidence. I will not use, of course, anyone's real names. But anyway, so if I'm meeting an inmate, and let's say his name is Alan Jones, it'll just say A. Jones on the sheet. And I notice that the officers will tend to refer to the inmates as simply Jones. You know, Jones, do you want to have a shower? Jones, we have to move you. Mealtime Jones, that kind of thing. And I found when I first, well, I'm getting into my working with the inmates, which I'll hold off for another video. So that's sort of interesting too, because it has a certain connotation. Now I've made it my practice to check a different sheet and get to know the person's first name, and I usually introduce myself. Well, actually, I always introduce myself, especially if I haven't met them before. But even if I have met them before, I'll introduce myself, and I say something like, "My name's Peter. You know, are you Alan?" or something like that. I find that first name kind of helps with the relationship, which I'll get into a little bit later. But the point is, it's highly regulated. And even though, I mean, obviously there's good reasons for why things need to be regulated, it does affect everyone there. I found it affecting me as well, that the whole setting is institutional. It reminds me a little bit, it has a certain feel of a hospital. It has certain smells of a hospital. Actually, one thing that really struck me about the physical space is the smell, something I didn't really consider. And it's not like a good smell, I'm not going to say that, but it's not always terrible either. It has sort of a vaguely, like I said, a hospital-y kind of smell with sort of strong cleaners and disinfectants. But there's also some very human smells, body odor, the smell of feces and urine in some cases, depending on what's going on. The smell of, you know, people with poor oral hygiene, those sorts of things. And, you know, I'll get into it a little bit later, but, you know, some of the inmates that I work with are in areas where they're in what's called a dry cell. So things aren't flushing, but anything that comes out of them has to stay in the cell until it's checked and before it's disposed of. So that area there, when there's people on dry cell, it has a, well, I'll just say, I don't mean to be disparaging, but it sort of reminded me of being like at a petting zoo as a kid, where it's sort of a farm, like animal smell, but also a disinfectant, like not like things have been let go for a long time. But anyway, maybe too much information. So there's smells. The physical space, everything looks the same as every other part, which is kind of disorienting and sort of strange, where you can be in one unit that is designed, like the physicality of the space is identical to another one, but there's different people in there and maybe slight differences. But it feels, so you can kind of walk through this maze of a place and you get to a new unit and it feels exactly like this other unit that you're in. If you've ever, like, you know, lived in the suburbs, I grew up in the suburbs, and there's only so many floor plans of the houses in our area. So I had a friend like across the street, and his house was identical to my house, but flipped. Now, of course, his parents decorated different, so there's a lot, but the shape of the house and the rooms were identical in many cases. It's like that, but even more so because there isn't unique furniture or painting or color schemes. These are the same layout, the same size rooms, the same corridors, the same doors that separate them. So it's a little strange. I remember, I think my first week there, my supervisor at the institution, we were in one area, and he asked me if I could go back to our office, which is in the secure area, but in a certain corridor. And he said, can you go back and fetch something? I can't remember what it was. I said, yes, I think so. But just finding my way back when everything looks the same as everything else, it was a little bit difficult. So you got the physical space, the people, and that sort of things are sort of depersonalized, certainly to a large degree, especially as it relates to the inmates. And I'm not making a judgment call on, like, I'm not trying to say this is good or bad or necessary or unnecessary. I simply want to describe what's there. What else? The sound. You know, as I'm getting older, I realize my hearing is not as good as it used to be. And it can be with all these concrete walls, and you get people like yelling or screaming or even talking loudly in some of these corridors with hard walls. Everything echoes, and it can be difficult to understand or to hear someone's voice, especially if they're talking through from their cell and they're in an enclosed area. So just the soundscape is somewhat foreign. It's a little bit like if you've ever been in I guess it's not quite that bad. I was going to say it's a little bit like being if you've been in an apartment building, you've gone down a stairwell and it's all concrete and fireproof, and tried to have a conversation with someone, and your clomping of your feet is echoing, and it's akin to that, where there's just so much echo in some of these areas that it makes it difficult to talk. Yeah, so that's some of the physical space considerations for doing ministry there. And it's funny because people are people, that's true, but I think we are affected by the space we're in for all kinds of reasons. If you've been part of my schooling here, there's one assignment I did in a different class where I would have to go to different church worship services of different traditions and kind of read the worship service, and part of that was sort of reading the architecture of the building itself. So paying less attention to what is said or done in the space, but more in the symbols, the space, the assumptions. And there is certainly, I guess I kind of knew this subconsciously, but we pick up cues from our surroundings. I'll just share two sort of contrasting examples. The type of church that I'm maybe more used to, which might be more evangelical, Protestant, I want to say modern, I'm not sure if that's quite the right term, but contemporary, let's say. So maybe a church that isn't even in a traditional church building, or it might be. And you have people that might dress like this, and the norm is you go into the lobby or even into the sanctuary before the service starts, and it's normative for people to be chit-chatting with one another, greeting one another, talking about how their week was, or whether they're going to the cottage or they see the Blue Jays game. And and then when the service starts, people are sometimes asked to take their seats and the service is about to begin. Contrast that with going to a Roman Catholic church, for example, where you have high ceilings, you have echoes, so any sort of talking kind of gets amplified. And even if you're not Roman Catholic, if you walk into one of these spaces, without really thinking about it, you pick up the norms of what other people are doing there. And there is more solemnity, if that's a word. It's more solemn. I think solemnity might be a word. Anyway, it's a solemn environment. It's hushed tones, and you tend to follow that lead. So all that to say that the physical space of a jail says a lot and affects both someone working as a chaplain and obviously affects the inmate. It's kind of laughable to even mention that, but their physical context has a lot to do with what they're experiencing, how they're viewing their life, how they filter things from their point of view. So anyway, I'll leave it there. That's the physical space. Perhaps next I'll talk a little bit about the work that I do, the sort of nuts and bolts of the conversations I have and sort of how I approach those conversations and what sorts of things tend to happen. And we'll go from there. Well, thanks for watching.